Lots of people think Britain might be heading for civil war. I'm going to fight the good fight. The mass immigration was the greatest act of harm in our history. We've had more immigration in the past 2 decades than in the past 2,000 years. I firmly believe that you have to defend what you believe in. We've been ideologically subverted as a nation. These radical extremist left-wing elements, they wanted essentially to have bombs in the streets and civil unrest and try to foment the discord and demoralization and destabilization.
Even when you have people on the streets of London calling for jihad, we have a police force that bends over backwards to understand jihad as meaning something innocent.
The Islamic population is the only population that has a birth rate that's increasing. You've got a generation of students who are being taught national self-loathing rather than love of nation. Sadiq Khan always tells us he's the son of a Pakistani bus driver very proudly. Pakistan is the global center of slavery. What sort of atrocity will actually finally motivate the British people to act? The revolution has already happened. Britain is a post-revolutionary society. This is my country. I was born here and I will be British till I die. Islamophobia is a nonsense term that shouldn't exist. No religion, no ideology should be free from criticism.
So, 20 or 30 years, what's your escape plan?
Well,
I'm Jonathan Sacerdoti. Rafe Heydel-Mankoo, great to be with you. Thanks for joining me today. How are you doing?
I'm doing very well. Long admired your writings in The Spectator, and recently been cheering you on in your Oxford Union debate, so it's nice to actually meet you in person.
Well, thank you very much. I've long admired all your work. You're a great thinker and explainer of important things. So I'm pleased that we'll have this conversation today. And I thought maybe let's start with where we are as Britain today, because I know that you and I both commentate somewhat differently on the status of British society and many of the things that are wrong with it. What do you think at the moment is most wrong in British society?
Well, I think the most crucial thing I try to get people to understand, and not to be melodramatic about it, is that Britain is a post-revolutionary society. The revolution has already happened, and revolutions don't require mobs in the streets and red flags flying from rooftops. We've had a quiet revolution that's taken place over the course of decades, and it's led to the capture of all our institutions, and in a sense we've been ideologically subverted as a nation. So the institutions of this country, from the civil service to all of our museums and galleries, to our legacy media, to our academia, to the parliament itself, they look the same. But the people who inhabit those institutions are cuckoos in the nest. They bear no comparison to the generations who actually build and run those institutions. And of course, it's institutions that set the tone for the culture of the nation. It's institutions that essentially mold minds. And what this is called, people may be familiar with this term, the long march through the institutions. And that's what it is. There's been a long, slow, gradual, almost imperceptible march through institutions, which gathered speed under Tony Blair, but it actually goes back long before Tony Blair. And a lot of people tend to just view this as, oh, this is all about Tony Blair. And I know if a lot of people now are talking about a great repeal bill, all we need to do is just reverse all of Tony Blair's terrible legislation and we'll be back to some sort of normality. I'm afraid the problem is much deeper than that, because I'm sure most people understand now this is a global phenomenon. It's a Western phenomenon, I should say, very much a Western phenomenon, especially an Anglosphere phenomenon. And that's also quite important because this emanates from ultimately this culture which some people call woke. I call it American Marxism. I think woke is too much of a soft and cuddly term, emanated from America. And so you often hear people say, well, woke is a mind virus. It's true, but it's a mind virus transmitted through the English language. And of course, where is woke strongest? In the Anglosphere, then in Scandinavia and in the Netherlands, where of course English is as well spoken as English is. And the less countries speak English, the lower the degree to which you find left infiltration with these new ideologies of the new left or woke, or the progressive left. Now, how did we get to this position where, in Canada, Australia, New Zealand, here, it seems as if the culture's gone completely topsy-turvy. We've seen gender ideology and critical race theory, post-colonial theory, decolonization, statues being pulled down, mass migration, Black Lives Matter. How did all of this come to be? Well, not to give too long of a history lesson, after the Russian Revolution, communists in Europe were puzzled and really distressed because they always assumed that the communist revolution would happen in the industrialized West. And where did it happen? It happened in agrarian cultures. It happened in feudal cultures in China and in Russia. And they realized that the foot soldiers of the revolution, those that were supposed to carry on the revolution, the proletariat, were actually small c conservative patriots, much like, of course, we found with the Red Wall voters who deserted the Labour Party and went over firstly to Boris Johnson and voted for Brexit because they also are small c conservatives. And suddenly they realized that although classical Marxism was all about the proletariat and the bourgeoisie, the oppressor and the oppressed, and the need to seize the means of industrial production to get control of the factories and all that, they realized that wasn't going to work in the West. The economics wasn't going to be the way to do it. They needed to change the mentality of the proletariat. They needed to seize the means of cultural production. So they needed to control all the things that make people patriotic. So the schools, the colleges, the newspapers, everything that essentially sets the zeitgeist for a nation. And so there was the chap who put this forward is a person called Antonio Gramsci, who was an Italian communist, and he developed this idea. And at the same time, you had in Frankfurt, in Germany, the rise of the Frankfurt School, which was deliberately looking at how we can actually have a communist revolution of sorts by using culture. Herbert Marcuse was one of the names some of your viewers may be familiar with. Then after the Second World War, people from the Frankfurt School went to America. No point living in Germany immediately post-war, and they went into the universities, particularly places like Berkeley in California and so forth. And suddenly these radical ideas began to permeate through American academia. And of course, by the time you got to, say, 1968, you saw that the effects of this when you saw, of course, the students rioting and you saw so much unrest being fermented. The idea was working. And it was at this time that you began to get the rise of these radical extremist left-wing elements, things like the New Left. And these chaps wanted to have a revolution overnight. They wanted essentially to have bombs in the streets and civil unrest. And there was a chap called Rudi Deutschke who said, hang on, chaps, this is 1960s America. It's still very, very conservative, very patriotic. I mean, Americans love their country. We can't change their minds overnight. We need to have a long march through the institutions. We need to train a generation of students, indoctrinate them with these ideas, and they will then go into all of the other institutions as qualified teachers, professors, civil servants, government ministers, and so forth. That's how we do it. And he says we can't rely on the working man because the working man is essentially still patriotic. We need to actually look at minorities, and minorities are going to be the foot soldiers of the revolution rather than the working class. So you're going to look at women, look at ethnic minorities, look at homosexuals and lesbians, look at trans and so forth. Basically, use the minorities and try to foment the discord and demoralization and destabilization through that. And as one political scientist put it very well, when he said, everyone thinks about Marxism as being this traditional economic Marxism of the bourgeoisie and the proletariat, but actually it's one of several species of Marxism. If you think of it like a cat is a genus of Marxism, but then you have leopards, tigers, tabby cats, jaguars. So traditional economic Marxism was the proletariat and the bourgeoisie, but then you got radical feminism, and that was an attack on masculinity and the qualities of maleness that, of course, made Western civilization so great. Then you got then you got gender queer theory, and queer theory was all about also attacking the family and masculinity. Then you also got things like critical race theory, which is again about attacking whiteness. And so these were all ways in which you were attacking the fundamental pillars that were the foundation of the success of Western civilization. And I find that analogy quite effective. And that's what we've seen. By the 1980s, of course, these people were being churned out of these universities, and that's what we've seen. The 80s, the 90s, slowly, first in academia, elsewhere, we've seen this institutional capture. And what happened was, in the 1970s, there were organizations like Prairie Fire in America who put out pamphlets talking about things like white privilege, systemic racism. And these were such radical ideas. These pamphlets only circulated to around 100 people. They were things only spoken about in conspiratorial underground basements and so forth. Now those radical Marxist ideas of critical race theory and so forth, decolonization, that's become part of mainstream academic life. And people who are perpetuating it aren't Marxists. I'm not saying this is a Marxist conspiracy, but at its root they're Marxists. But the Overton window has shifted so much that you have well-meaning liberals, part of the Be Kind Brigade, who just think they're being nice, and they're actually promoting radical far-left Marxism. And at the golden core of it is an attempt to undermine Britain, America, and the West, and essentially to demoralize and destabilize the society, to disconnect us from any pride in who we are as a people, and by so doing, in essence, to introduce new myths and a new ideology, that diversity built Britain, for example, and essentially create a new society.
And to what end? So obviously, I find your explanation incredibly coherent and persuasive, but obviously those who did that, I don't think had what they would consider to be nefarious or uh, sinister reasons for doing it. They think they're improving the world and humanity, and indeed many of them would probably say this is just actually the evolution of progression, hence the idea that they call themselves progressives. So what is their aim for having put in place this kind of coordinated capture of our institutions?
Well, as I say, at its root cause, the originators of all of this were Marxists. So that is, it's undeniable that this came out of the Frankfurt School and it came to America, took root there. That's why it's called American Marxism. So the ideas that were permeated, the genus of the whole thing, the roots of the family tree are Marxist. But the people purveying it today simply aren't aware that they are putting forward Marxist ideas. They want to be kind. So they believe, of course, in that, racism is one of the key issues facing this country. Whereas we know from all the evidence, Britain is one of the top 3 least racist countries. Brazil, Sweden, and Britain are the world's 3 least racist nations. But so indoctrinated have our youth been, for example, that they think racism is the number 1 issue facing this country, ahead even of, for them, Brexit and climate change and so forth like that. So it's part of this idea now that this constant belief that women are oppressed, this constant belief that that being the black of an ethnic minority in this country is a huge disadvantage, despite, of course, white working class boys being the most disadvantaged. So in an effort to be kind, people are promoting these ideologies, not understanding actually that they're promoting radical Marxist ideology. And the purpose of that Marxist ideology was to create a communist revolution, to overthrow and undermine our institutions and structures from the monarchy down.
And it's part of the problem then that many of these changes are actually carefully coordinated and planned and carried out, and they are, in some respects, irreversible. So I know, for example, this whole discussion over immigration here, it's pretty difficult to undo a demographic change, which also is not just great in and of itself, but it results in different birth rates inside migrant communities that have changed the shape of a certain country society. And I know that you've talked about it before, and we do discuss these things, that under Tony Blair, though you say it doesn't start with Blair, but under Tony Blair, there was almost calculated admission of migrants because it would change the political shape of the country, because those communities are more likely to vote Labour. It's an effective way of saying, well, Britain is small c conservative, even big C conservative, so let's change what Britain is. How do you undo that?
Well, that's a huge challenge and a huge task, but you're quite right. So we've had 2 great governments in place for since 1997. The first one, the Labour Party, wanted to rub the right's nose in diversity, as the speechwriter to the immigration minister said, by flooding the nation with immigrants. And the hope there was, because 80% of immigrants at that time voted for the Labour Party, they would have a new demographic that would ensure that there will be Labour majorities decades to come. But afterwards, of course, under Boris Johnson particularly, things were even worse. I mean, immigration, we had a quadrupling of immigration under Boris Johnson, much of which, of course, came from the developing world. And the idea there was simply that the Tory party was beholden to big business and didn't want to invest in capital infrastructure, which was very costly. Far easier, rather than investing in job automation and robotics, to just flood the nation with cheap labor who would also undercut and suppress wages for everybody else, which is why we're so stagnant at the moment. How do you reverse all this? Well, I mean, that requires another program in and of itself. But I'm quite encouraged, actually, to give credit where it's due. We see the first steps of that now with Keir Starmer's new proposals on immigration, having, of course, been a great drum beater for immigration. I think it's outrageous that he's only now taking action when, of course, his feet are being put to the fire by the Reform Party, and he can see that Labour faces an existential crisis, especially in the north of England, to reform. And only now, in the 11th hour, 1 minute to midnight, are they actually taking action. It requires a lot to be done. The first thing you need to do is you need to stop immigration from those parts of the world where we are having a net drain on our economy, and from places that are culturally incompatible with the rest of the country. We know, for example, that North Africa, the Middle East, Afghanistan, and Pakistan and Bangladesh, they account for the vast majority of rapes in the world. I mean, they're the global center of rape in the world. And of course, since we've had mass immigration from those parts of the world, we've seen a quadrupling of rape in this country. In Germany, Afghanis and Pakistanis are 16 times more likely to commit rape than Germans are.
Wow,
There's
why do you
multiple
think that is?
votes. It's because of the culture. These are cultures where sexuality is repressed. They live in families and houses where they never have any time to themselves or alone, and they live in societies where, of course, the opportunities for them to have sex in normal ways don't exist. And there's a demeaning value of women, and there's an adoration also. There's a sort of a fetishization, particularly of European women. Any European woman who's been to North Africa, for example, will have experienced what's that like, and the idea that people have that on the left that as soon as you come here, those age-old beliefs and things that you were brought up in go away. But you need to essentially understand that by 2050, if the Islamic population is the only population that has a birth rate that's increasing. For all other immigrant populations, within about a generation or so of arriving here, their birth rate goes down to the average of the native population. The exception to that is are Muslims, and with that and current rates of immigration, we're going to have a Muslim population which is about 4 million now, 6.5% of the population. That's forecast by the Pew Research Institute, which is a very well-respected, non-biased institution, to go up to just under 20% of the nation of the population will be Muslim by 2050 potentially, which is around 12 million people. And that, of course, is going to cause huge issues, as you're quite rightly saying. So how do you challenge that? Well, firstly, the policy of deporting illegal migrants for a start, because we now receive more illegal migrants in a year than we used to receive legal migrants in the 1980s. So that's how crazy things are. Our illegal migrants are larger than our legal migrants. We've had more immigration in the past 2 decades than in the past 2,000 years. More immigrants came last year than the entire decade of the 80s and 90s.
More in the last 2 decades than 2,000 years.
More immigrants in the last 2 decades than the last 2,000 years, and last year we had more immigrants than all of the 80s and all of the 90s combined. Though it's impossible for any society or culture to absorb and integrate that number of people. It's not racist to say that. People want to cleave to their own kind. You just have to go to Spain and see the English in Spain or in Dubai to see, of course, everyone likes to be together. But what we do know is once you have these large segregated communities being established, there's no incentive to integrate, and they just get larger and larger. They have their own communities, their own shops, they have their own places of worship, they watch their own television channels or satellite channels, and their daily lives pass with little or no interaction with wider society. And we know that those communities are twice as likely to be extremist as Muslims who don't live in segregated communities, and they also act as petri dishes for the cultivation of these abhorrent cultural practices which have no place in civilized society. So we've seen a huge rise in honor killings and honor kidnappings, where Muslim girls who are thought to have disgraced their families are either killed or taken out of the country. We see a rise in cousin marriage with all the birth defects that it brings in. I think 1% of the population have cousin marriages in Britain. It's 37% of Pakistanis who have cousin marriage. We see this with forced marriage as well. Child marriage is happening unknowns to the authorities. Britain's now the global center of acid attacks. You see now gangs fighting in the streets with machetes and so forth. And of course, these things are festering now in a sense because you also have a lot of these areas have become essentially no-go zones where the police have to even ask permission of local community leaders to go into them. So that's the challenge that we face, and it's not a challenge you can tackle overnight, but it does require a robust level of policies, some of which I'm pleased to say the Labour Party has just introduced, one of which is essentially making Britain less attractive than it has been, and less attractive than France. So that means cutting down on benefits. So of course, right now you can get benefits after 5 years of living here. I would increase that to 10 years because, of course, you have to understand a lot of what's happening is happening from low-skilled immigrants who are a net drain on the economy, and they're carrying benefits from the very beginning. So if you make Britain less attractive, you'll have fewer of them coming over.
So you surprised then that it's a Labour government that's taking these difficult steps, even if it's under pressure from the reform movement and from the right? Why did we have to wait through 14 years of a Conservative government?
Well, might you ask? Well, Tony Blair had more deportations than we ever saw under the Tories either. It's almost as if the Tories are so desperate not to be seen as a nasty party that they are not unwilling to do things which they think perhaps only a Labour government can get away with. And if you look at the reaction, for example, to what Keir Starmer has just proposed, if this had been proposed by a Conservative government, the amount of backlash you would have seen in the press and the media and elsewhere, you've seen some pushback in the media, but nowhere near what you would have seen. And even only a few backbencher MPs in the Labour Party have push back against it. But as I say, mass immigration was the greatest act of harm in our history. And the fact that it's taken this long for the Labour Party to act, and only after, of course, they feel that their future is in peril in terms of the next general election, I think that is cowardly, and I think it's indefensible. I think, the British people have never been given a referendum on mass immigration. This was foisted upon us. We were asked about Brexit, and yet this is much more consequential than leaving the EU. It's changed the fabric of our nation, completely changed towns and cities in which people lived and grew up. I think these people should be held accountable, quite frankly, because they are building up well, if I can quote somebody, the funeral pyres of many of our dearest towns and cities, which have become completely unrecognizable.
Not just somebody. First time that's been quoted here. So to put to you what some viewers might say, the elephant in the room here is that somebody called Sacerdoti is speaking to somebody called Heydel-Mankoo about immigration into the UK. So clearly you're not against, I presume, all immigration. You're not against people from other countries coming to live here. So what do you see as the difference then between you or me and our families that did not necessarily originate in this country and those who you're talking about?
We're talking about immigration versus mass immigration, fundamentally. That's the first thing to say. And, whenever I speak about this, and, we had it with Suella Braverman and others, people will say, how can you of all people say this? Well, I'm sorry, there's a big distinction between the sorts of levels of immigration we had in the 1980s and the 1970s and the 1990s to what we've experienced. I've just told you the numbers, how dramatically large that they are. And it's impossible to integrate that number of people. And of course, it's the type of immigrants who are coming over. But in the 80s and 90s, we had about 50,000 immigrants coming in net per year. And we had reached, I would think, a very happy stage in the evolution of this country by the late 90s, year 2000. We had got gay rights, we had women's rights, we had ethnic minorities were living happily and peacefully in one of the least racist countries in the world. And when you saw people like Daley Thompson, say, or Tessa Sanderson, black athletes at the Olympic Games, nobody saw them as being black or anything but British. We didn't see race in those ways any longer by the time we got to the 80s, 90s, and the early 2000s. We had a very harmonious society. Now everything is seen through the prism of race because of the flood of immigrants has been so huge that, of course, you automatically get communities demanding more influence and more power in their own areas and so forth. And what we do know is all the evidence shows us that the more ethnic diversity you have in an area, the less happy and safe and prosperous those communities are. What we had in the 80s and 90s were very decent levels of immigration, and more than 90% of the population was white British, but then you had a large ethnic population proportion. That's fine. You can still have a healthy society. The levels of diversity we're heading for, super diversity as we now have in Birmingham and in Burley, Bradford, and in London, that is the way for disaster. As I like to say, diversity is our greatest weakness. All of the sociological evidence, all of the economic evidence shows that people become more reclusive on the local level. They vote less. They don't go out as much. They don't engage with society. They become less trusting of one another. They even become less trusting of people of the same race. And that leads to a deterioration of public spaces and a growing sense of unease and uncertainty. And we all know that. And then just the simple habits, the types of people who used to come here used to come from Europe, or they would come from the Commonwealth, from the Caribbean and elsewhere. And they were still taught in a British type of schooling system, usually maybe a portrait of the Queen in the room and so forth. So their cultural habits weren't also that different. Now we've invited in so many people who are culturally incompatible, and those cultural practices tend to either distress and alarm or just simply annoy mild ways, littering on the streets. There's little antisocial behavior, shouting on the telephone, playing music. Back in those cultures, it's perfectly fine and normal to do that. To a British person, it's extremely rude and offensive, let alone the abhorrent cultural practices I've just spoken about. And so it's those tensions which, of course, are causing this fraying of social cohesion. This country, I think, is descending into a state where we have these ethno-nationalist silos, and so we're living side by side. We may be a multicultural society, but that's because we're living side by side. We're not integrating. We've never been more fractured and more divided.
So in your discussion of what you've called American Marxism, you mentioned that they actively sought out minority groups or groups which might feel a sense of victimhood in order to recruit them into this larger aim. And one of those groups that you have mentioned is actually Muslim immigrants. So I want to talk about that a little bit, in the sense that you're saying there are these segregated communities, which I think we're all familiar with. And I think technology has helped in that regard as well, because people can live now in a foreign country, almost as if they're not in that country. Between the internet, smartphones, satellite television, and what have you, you can pretty much exist in your own culture and language from somewhere else. Then you have your own shops, your own schools, because if there is a high enough concentration in your area of people from your own culture, you can create that. But I think it's, in a sense, even more than that. And I want to ask what happens when those minority groups actually sort of take on a capture of their own. So if they were part of a wider Marxist plot, let's say, is it the case that some of them have then thought, well, actually, we can seize power for ourselves, not as part of this overarching desire that we were once a piece of? And you end up with things like 5 independent MPs who effectively make up an informal Muslim political party in this country. We don't have a Christian political party. Such a thing would probably never fly if they started it. And yet, literally on the basis of being the Muslim vote, we now have 5 people who stood on the ticket of Gaza, and that one word meaning something else. And also, that sense of their culture has not stayed restricted to those areas where they live. It has spread. We have in supermarkets and restaurants the increase of halal meat for those who don't need or wants to stick to halal diets. It's now almost automatic. Some schools serving all meat as halal because of Muslim pupils in the school. Some would say nothing wrong with it. We're accommodating other people's needs at no cost to ourselves. But is there a danger that in its plan, this cultural American Marxism has recruited some communities which are actually stronger than it?
Yes, well, firstly, I'm not implying that everything that's happening today is a part of a great plot. I don't think Boris Johnson is part of this grand scheme. My point is the origins of all of this, and it's taken on a life of its own now with the capture of institutions. And I'm not saying that people who are running these things are Marxists at all. They're just useful idiots of what was originally Marxist ideology. But you're quite right. We are at the stage now where we are seeing the effects of mass immigration, and that is that people feel empowered, communities feel empowered to take on more power. The Labour Party is experiencing this to its horror because, of course, it, as happens with all badly thought out ideas, it's realizing the downsides now, and that essentially is that the ethnic minority vote they thought they could depend on has decided they don't need to vote for the Labour Party. They can actually have their own vote in form of the Muslim vote. So you do have these new Muslim MPs who weren't voted in to improve public services, who weren't elected to deal so much with their constituents, but they were elected on a platform about dealing with Gaza and Palestine, which, of course, for those people who don't care about Gaza or Palestine, they are not being represented by their elected officials. And this is why, of course, you're getting to a stage now where lots of people think Britain might be heading for civil war. There's a very good professor you should probably interview called Professor David Betts from the Department of War Studies at King's College London, and he thinks Britain's heading for civil war, and that actually, in terms of the Muslim community, they have reached the stage of critical mass where they're actually 2 stages into the 3 stages of classic Maoist insurgency. We've had a period of 25 years or so where the Muslim community, the Muslim extremists, the Wahhabis, the Deobandis, and the more extreme elements of radical Islam have been politically organizing, they have been propagandizing, they've been recruiting their own useful idiots to their cause. They've been securing money and getting their chaps into essentially positions of power in local councils. That's been happening over 25 years or so. Now they're in the sort of the second stage where they've got MPs in Parliament now. They've got a well-oiled system of structure within their organisation where they can even call upon some form of militia. We saw that with the Muslim Defence League during the Southport riots. These Muslim chaps almost in body armour.
No, it's in Amsterdam with the pogrom, as it was called by many, against the Jews and Israelis.
That's right. And we had in East London, people remember a few years ago, the Muslim Patrol enforcing Sharia law and telling off women who weren't dressed appropriately, pushing gays out of the community and attacking Muslims who were selling alcohol in off licenses and so forth. And of course, this is when you also get the terror attacks happening elsewhere. So you get these sporadic terror attacks, and this is sort of beginnings of internecine warfare that goes on.
Even internally, there was the killing of the Ismaili guy, I think it was in Scotland or in the north of England, I don't remember, some years ago. So even internally, you have groups of Muslims killing and targeting others who they don't believe are extreme enough for their own beliefs. So my question then about that is, as a Jewish person, I'm particularly aware of the Jewish community's fears and well-founded fears as a result of this when it comes to Muslim immigration in particular. And since October the 7th, there's been a resurgence of overt and unveiled anti-Semitism on the streets of the UK. A lot of the time, Jews are told, well, it's not anti-Semitism, you're trying to hush up a genocide or whatever it is. But, I think Jews know instinctively and historically what they're seeing. Is there a way then for those people, Jewish, Westerners, Brits, non-Muslims, who are opposed at this, aghast at this, now they're seeing it bear fruit, to counter it without having effectively to do the same thing themselves? Is it required that the people you might like, more traditional Westerners or Brits, should operate some form of institutional capture? Is the idea that Trump is pursuing to withdraw funding from universities, which don't seem to be standing up against this and seem to be preaching wokeism, is this the alternative, that we have to do what they did?
Yeah, unfortunately, the reality is you have to have a reverse long march through the institutions, and that doesn't happen overnight. There've been a couple of books written recently, "Woke is Dead," because of had like the Supreme Court ruling on who a woman is and so forth. But in reality, it won't happen until you've actually purged the universities, purged the institutions of those people who are now embedded in it. And realistically, that won't happen until they retire and a new generation comes in behind them. And that is it. But that requires political will. And I have not seen any political party in this country who have seemed to have understood the gravity of the situation. Trump has done it in America very much with his war on woke and his defunding of the universities and Harvard. That's the sort of action we need to see. And if those policies, in terms of migration, they have a bit of a different issue because they've got Catholics and Christians coming up from South America. So they're not facing quite the same degree of crisis we are, although anti-Semitism, of course, is a huge problem in America too. But that's also happening a lot from the post-truth right there. If what Trump is doing with universities and woke works well, I think you're going to see sort of a wave crashing on the shores of Britain and Europe, and people will be encouraged to embrace those policies because it does need to be done. Because quite frankly, it's also not just that. You need to have a long march through the mosques. Ed Hussein wrote this very good book Among the Mosques, and he said 40% of the mosque of this country, maybe now it's half the mosques in this country, are run by the extremist Deobandi sect, which is the sect that gave birth to the Taliban. Half of the prison chaplains who are Muslim imams or whatever, they are Deobandis as well, radicalizing and indoctrinating Muslims in prison as well. So what do we do about that? My view on that sort of thing is quite simply, I'm a free speech absolutist, apart from inciting violence and so forth. But if we're now in a state where pensioners get arrested for tweeting the most harmless things, why on earth don't we have people inside these mosques, undercover agents, spies, ex-Muslims, whatever, recording and reporting what's happening in these mosques?
You refer to pensioners. There's that guy who was in the Telegraph, who was a retired special constable, and his crime, as they showed the body cameras, was that he had some Douglas Murray books and some copies of The Spectator in the room, and they thought his wife might be a terrorist because she was buying bleach on her shopping list.
And then someone said to me, "How come Douglas Murray never gets arrested? Just people who have his books."
Well, they're going to have to do quite a police operation. It's something of a bestseller. So I think the idea that mainstream best-selling authors, mainstream common sense opinions, and buying bleach if you're a hairdresser, criminalizing that, you're right. Instead, why not concentrate the same efforts? We've seen these videos. I think Talk TV did quite a good compilation of these Friday prayers, filmed and put out for people to see. It's not even secret filming. There is a sort of unabashed character to it that I think a lot of the problem, and I'd like to hear what you think about this, is that we have become so neutered as a culture and a society that even when other cultures or forces tell us exactly what they want to do, what they're doing, even when you have people on the streets of London calling for jihad, we have a police force that bends over backwards to understand jihad as meaning something innocent. Whereas when a man says on X, something like that Kent pensioner did, that the next up you'll be storming Heathrow Airport looking for Jews, that's seen as a crime or a potential crime, and calling for jihad on the streets isn't. How on earth do you have any hope that we could possibly redress this if it's going to take a similar march through the institutions from, let's say, the right, if we can just accept that label? It doesn't seem possible.
The problem is, for too long in this country, we have elevated minority cultures over the prevailing British culture, and we have been so weighed down by this notion of imperial guilt and white guilt and the original sin of slavery and so forth, that everyone seems to be reluctant. Originally, we thought it was just because of fear of being politically incorrect and so forth. But of course, now there's the fear of cancellation for being seen to be Islamophobic, for challenging things which are truly horrific. But of course, mustn't forget also, of course, and I don't think enough people understand the degree to which certainly the Labour Party and others are beholden to the Muslim vote, but especially, of course, because of being fearful of losing the Muslim vote over the support for Israel. They're now basically unwilling to do anything that would antagonize Muslim communities or Muslim leaders. Classic example, of course, being the rape gangs in the north of England, where, of course, we understand now that Labour councillors and Labour councils were being given postal votes, signed postal votes, but where no one voted on them, in exchange for their silence on things like the rape gangs and so forth, and, for getting tranches of these votes. So the idea that today, in the 21st century, we still have corrupt politics of that sort of level, importing in many senses the politics of Pakistan and elsewhere into this country, shows that this is a deeply entrenched problem that we need to deal with. And it's not just because of political correctness and so forth. It's actually got deeply troubling issues that affect our very democracy in this country.
So if we think about immigration, it doesn't have to be a force for bad, even in high volume. If I think the immigrant communities are able to assimilate and to become more like the host nation.
You can't assimilate large numbers of people, and that's even with people who are culturally compatible. My great uncle was aide-de-camp to the Polish president during the Second World War, and when Poland got invaded, they went to France, and then they came here. Now, he'd lived in this country for 60 years. His grandmother was a cousin of the Duke of Devonshire and was fully into a picture of the Queen in the room, loved this country, went to Ascot and did all that sort of stuff, and yet always identified as being Polish. After 60 years living, he still wasn't British. That was always home. And we would watch TV and he'd say, "Oh, don't the British make good documentaries?" After 60 years. So if you can't assimilate somebody like that after that many decades, you have to understand the challenge when you're dealing with people from an entirely different culture. And this is also about the type of immigrant you're inviting in. So I think Canada had the thing done very well in the 1960s and 70s and 80s, where it was inviting in the most talented, the exceptional. They were cherry picking the best immigrants to come over here, high skilled immigrants, and they benefited Canada. And that was a multicultural success story of the 60s and 70s and 80s. We've done the opposite. We've invited in the majority of immigrants who've come in, particularly in the last 15 years, have been low skilled immigrants. The majority of them, from the moment they set foot on British soil, are a net drain on the economy. The average low-skilled immigrant, by the time they get to pension age, each of them costs £150,000 a year. By the time they get to 81, they cost £465,000 a year. There's no integration going on, and they're a net drain on the economy. So yeah, I'm all for proper immigration, but the immigration that we need, we're not getting. Only 0.8 of immigrants we've had recently have been doctors. Only 0.6% have been scientists and engineers. The cost, 1 million foreigners in this country are now claiming benefits, £7.5 billion a year. Something has clearly gone wrong, and you cannot assimilate. 72% of Somalis are living in social housing. There is nothing wrong with immigration, but there have to be the right type of immigrants who are benefiting this country, not receiving benefits from it.
So I suppose where I was hoping to lead with that is the idea that maybe this country, through the things you mentioned, such as shame or embarrassment at colonialism and slavery, misguided as I know you think that is, have, in a sense, a kind of embarrassment and shame about Britishness. And so immigration to this country has been done somewhat out of guilt rather than out of pride. And countries like America, which you say are suffering as well, but perhaps less so or differently. And I always think of Israel, a country which is made up very largely of immigrant populations of Jews, admittedly, from all around the world. Those countries have, I think, a sense of pride, and people often emigrate en masse out of a love for that host nation's culture and the freedoms there. I feel like in Britain, we're not in that position. We're accepting swathes of immigrants because of guilt for perceived crimes we've committed historically. And as such, we're not willing to try to even encourage assimilation in the way that, say, America or more particularly Israel might do. Israel has had so many methods to try and impose assimilation, some actually quite sinister and horrible, looking back historically, but predominantly, I think, through teaching of the language and through sort of spreading of the culture, it sets something of an example. Do you think, again, that's something that we can fix here? As we're a nation with very little pride left, people don't wave the flag here unless they are considered racist or...
You're absolutely right. If you're a young immigrant who's come over here, why would you buy into Britain when everything you watch on television tells you about how evil the British Empire is? At school, all the exhibitions and museums and galleries, everything basically in some way denigrates Britain's achievements and its legacy, tearing down statues, false myths about Winston Churchill and Nelson and everybody else. You're far more likely to cleave to that sort of masculine, well-defined culture of your parents if that's the alternative. And again, we have always elevated for the last 25, 30 years minority cultures over the prevailing British culture. In 2004, 80% of youth 18 to 24 were proud to be British. Now it's only 40%. It's halved in that period of time. The only way you can deal with this is by changing the school curriculum. Forget the universities, it has to start at the primary and secondary school level, and it's not happening. I mean, we've got the most radically left-wing youth in history. We've never seen such radicalism on a whole slew of policy issues. The youth of today are completely out of kilter with every other generation, even though it's just 10 years older. That's them more want to become a republic than stay a monarchy, more thinking that Britain is racist. Only 20% approve of Winston Churchill. Just 20 years ago, he won the Greatest Britain vote in this country. That shows you how radicalized they've become. And the rise of left-wing youth has mirrored the rise in left-wing teachers. So now 90% of school teachers are left-wing, and it's no surprise that the number of pupils who are left-wing is also 90%. When I was at university, you used to have, there were 2 liberals for every 1 conservative professor. Now it's about 15 to 1. In my profession in history in Harvard, I think it's 1 or 2% of historians are actually right-wing. So you've got a generation of students who are being taught national self-loathing rather than love of nation. And that's the core point. And the best way you can instill a love of nation and love of country, yes, you can do things like flying the flag every day in school, singing the national anthem, all of which I'm in favor of. But you need to start teaching balanced history, which doesn't focus exclusively on the negatives. So yes, the British Empire did bad things, but also it did a hell of a lot of good things, actually. I would say the good outweighs the bad, particularly the second half of the British Empire. Celebrate that whilst acknowledging the other. For some reason, students today think that only Britain and America were involved in slavery. These are the great original sins into which both countries were born. Of course, slavery is universal.
All going on right now.
Oldest prostitution. Yeah, there are 10 million people living in bondage in Africa. There are hundreds of slaves sold every week still in Libya. So people need to have a reason to be proud in this country, and they don't get any reason to be proud. So I'm no surprise, therefore, that they have such low levels of passion or patriotism for Britain.
In a sense, when we talk about slavery, it's a good example. In fact, I've heard you speak, very, very frequently about how Britain actually was quite fundamental in ending the slave trade. But putting that aside, I wonder if the reluctance to talk about slave trading and owning parts of the world today is also connected with this weird criticism of whiteness. So it only really counts as slavery, even if it's historic as opposed to present, if it was white people trading non-white slaves. When you point to parts of Africa or you point to Gulf countries and Middle East, where slave ownership is actually part of the culture, it is legalized in certain ways. Why is there that reluctance? It's obviously not about slavery. Is it about criticizing whiteness, and slavery is just a tool with which to beat white traditional societies?
Yeah, I mean, there are a few better examples of what I was talking about different types of Marxism and how they're using minority grievances to try to advance the cause. And the classic case is slavery, because I would have far more time for those who are actually making the case for slavery reparations or trying to make us feel guilty for slavery if they were equally vocal about modern slavery and they were boycotting and protesting outside the embassies and high commissions of Sudan and Niger and Nigeria and Cameroon and Mali and Mozambique and elsewhere, where, of course, we have 7 in every 1,000 Africans as a slave today. As I always like to say, Sadiq Khan always tells us he's the son of a Pakistani bus driver very proudly. Pakistan is the global center of slavery, yet he keeps beating us up about slavery, and he wants a slavery museum in this country. Yet he went on an official tour, an official visit to Pakistan. Not once did he mention the plight of people today. And I think that's so telling, because surely the plight of people today who can be saved is more important than fretting about things that happened 200 years ago, which is 8 generations in the past. And so I think that speaks more volumes than anything about what's really going on here.
When you talk about this being a mind virus of the Anglosphere specifically, I'm curious to hear a bit more about that, because I would say that instinctively I would have felt this has spread out of the Anglosphere. It's also across Western Europe, and I mean, somewhat amusingly, I remember seeing a video going around of an Italian chap trying to explain how you say non-binary in Italian. So that it was non-binario for a man and non-binaria for a woman. Amusingly. But the point being, it's obviously spread far more extensively than just in the Anglosphere. Why do you consider this specifically an English language issue?
Well, David Starkey likes to say all bad things come from France. In this case, this very bad thing, the worst thing of recent times, has come from America. But like, American culture has seeped throughout the world. You know, people will wear Coke baseball caps and have McDonald's in, you know, Africa and Asia and elsewhere. So the first people to hear the good news of woke were in the Anglosphere. That's why it's been strongest in Britain and Canada and Australia. As I like to say, when America sneezes, we get a cold. Then it went to the most bilingual parts of Western Europe. That's why Scandinavia is so woke, and, you know, and Denmark and Holland and so forth. But yes, of course, we now have the first true lingua franca is the English language. It is the most spoken language as a second language of people. And so that's why these messages have spread, just as American culture and movies have spread around the world. And of course, Netflix, Hollywood, these are the vehicles by which wokery is spread around the world, of course. And they may be translated into different languages, but the messaging is implicit there.
So if this has been a sort of quiet revolution, not the typical kind, is the problem not that really Britishness, traditional Britishness, British people are not really revolutionary types, and it's not really part of our historical tendency or culture, and yet what we're now requiring, from everything I'm hearing you say, is nothing less than at least a mirroring of their slow march through the institutions, but probably something more akin to the kind of civil war you've mentioned. Actually, it's interesting you say that, because every time I'm speaking with Americans, and I was just there a few weeks ago, a lot of people say, is there going to be a civil war? Instinctively, I feel don't be ridiculous, we're British. But really, that seems to be an increasingly asked question. Is the Civil War Reform UK? Is the Civil War subtle and a march through institutions? Is the Civil War a literal civil war? And maybe in America, the Civil War has been Trumpism, but we don't have executive orders. It doesn't seem like anyone, you know, Nigel Farage or anyone else can come into power and suddenly undo all of these things in 100 days or fewer. So what's the British version of Trumpism, executive orders? What's the British version of civil war and revolution in 2025?
So, well, there are two distinct things there. So civil war, as I was discussing it earlier, and as Professor Betts and others have put forward, isn't the sort of American Civil War thing where you have widespread, you know, carnage everywhere, but much closer, I would say, to what we saw in Northern Ireland. So it's the importation of sectarianism here. And as you had in Northern Ireland, you had the state trying to control two combatants. You had Catholics and you had the Protestants, IRA and also Defence Force. In Britain, what's going to happen is you're going to have low-scale disruption and violence happening, as you saw in Northern Ireland, terrorist attacks and so forth. And there's going to be Muslims on the one side who are very well advanced in this, and there's the emergence of a white identity movement, which is still very much in its infancy, doesn't exist in very, very strong ways, not organized, but that's also, like with Islam, a 20-year project. But they're going to essentially get to a stage where you have the equivalent of the IRA and the UDF, the loyalists and the nationalists, and it's going to be those two players. And that's the future in terms of civil war, but it's not going to be a full scale with tanks and so-called firing at each other. But in terms of revolution, well, we did have the first revolution in Europe, of course, because we cut the head off our king. So we do have the ability to do that. But the problem that Britain has faced is that we have never lost our freedoms before. We've never been a country that has experienced the things that Europe has experienced. And I've wondered why, given the huge impact upon this culture, the disintegration of our societies, all the things I've talked about in terms of cultural tensions and ethnic tensions, and the importation of all these beliefs, why we haven't had a violent uprising as we've seen in Ireland. Now, Ireland has only experienced immigration for a very short period of time compared to what we've had to undergo for decades. And yet they've already taken to the streets, and they've had mobs out, and they've had some violence as well. And of course, the reason is much the same way that Eastern and Central Europe are opposed to having mass immigration to their cultures, because they had their identity suppressed. They lost their freedoms, particularly in Central and Eastern Europe. They lost their identity, they lost their culture under the Soviet jackboot. And so they value those things far more because they were lost. We have never actually had to deal with that in this country, and I think we're ill-prepared to deal with genuine threats to, and that's the disadvantage of being the world's oldest unbroken democracy.
And so in a sense, we don't know what to do. We've never had to do it. The thing I often talk about that is, in relation to is in comparison to Israel, where when it comes to jihadism and when it comes to jihadi terrorism, Israel is well versed, unfortunately, in that threat and what it means. And the ultimate was October the 7th, because it was just such a horrific and the biggest and most successful, if one can put it that way, jihadi invasion. Israel is engaged in this now 18-month plus war with the jihadis in Gaza and all around it. It seems to those of us who follow it closely and think as I do, that it's doing a pretty good job. Nothing's perfect. There's plenty we can criticize in terms of any country's actions, especially in wartime. But generally speaking, it's had extraordinary success, whether it's been in Lebanon or in Syria or in Gaza, though that's qualified and restricted by the hostage issue. And yet Britain looks on at that, the very same threat we do really face here, though in a slightly different form. And instead of learning from it or supporting it openly and as an ally which knows it's going to have to learn from that, we see increasing condemnation, we see increasingly hostile language and a climate of disapproval, disgust, which has a knock-on effect on the domestic Jewish community here, who are all feeling pretty at risk, terrified, and perhaps like they won't stay here for the rest of their lives. Why is it that Britain is so reluctant to learn, except perhaps through direct personal experience? And even then, you blow up Manchester Arena full of little girls, and the security guard who saw the terrorist said, I didn't want to say anything because I thought it might be racist that I was suspicious about him. And even after the event, it's far right or extremist to criticize this. It's a lost cause, isn't it?
I often despair, and I think, what will it take? If you had the Southport murders of those poor girls, you had the Manchester Arena bombing, what sort of atrocity will actually finally motivate the British people to act? Now, we did see people who were not far right, and they were denounced as far right thugs disgraced by Keir Starmer, and now we just had a report out, an official report saying actually there was no far right involvement in that. These were concerned people, and even when you do get the decent people of England, as G.K. Chesterton said, we are the people of England who have not spoken yet. When they do speak up, they're immediately called racist, and they're immediately denounced and suppressed. And I think a great deal of it is because the British state knows how serious the issue is, and they realize what they've imported into this country, and that we are a tinderbox waiting to go off. And I think they're doing everything they can to suppress it. And the best way to suppress it is to demonize those who try to draw attention to it. That's why people get cancelled, and why we have these conversations only on YouTube rather than in the mainstream media. And it's because I think, as I've pointed out recently, there are 40,000, or over 40,000 people on the terror watch list by MI5. Over 90% of them are jihadis.
40,000? I thought it was closer to 4,000.
No, there are over 40,000, maybe closer to 50,000 now, but over 40,000, 90% of them are jihadis.
What level is this, like listed as people with extreme opinions or worse?
These are people being monitored by the secret services, by GCHQ and MI5.
That's an extraordinary number.
40,000 is larger than the size of Hamas on October the 7th, the combined forces of Hamas on October the 7th. 40,000 is larger than the size of the ISIS army in Iraq during their infamous invasion in 2014. 40,000 is half the size of the full-time British army. And when you realize that the Muslim population is going to grow from 6.5% to just under 20%, that means currently 1 in every 100 Muslims is on the terror watch list.
So where is the 40,000 number from?
That's the official
number.
The official statistic on the terror watch list. And think of the cost to the British state and our intelligence services monitoring 40,000 people. 1 in 100 Muslims. Those are just Muslims who are on the terror watch list. Of course, there's a far wider segment of society who identify as being Islamists and who support terrorism. The polling I saw from Populous shows that 9% of Muslims in this country identify as Islamists and supporters of terrorism. 9% is around 400,000 people. By the time you get to 2050, if you look at population increases, you're going to have 120,000 people on the terror watch list. That's larger, 1/3 larger than the size of the full-time British Army. And you're going to have 1.2 million people who identify as Islamists, let alone those who don't identify as Islamists. That's larger than the size of the American army. These are the challenges that I think the government understands perhaps and is too scared to admit. And rather than trying to deal with it, they've kept their head in the sand, which is only going to make the problem worse. And I think this is the greatest challenge. And we've increased defense spending to 2.5% of GDP, which I support. I think it should be 3%. But all of our focus is on the external threats to this country. It's the internal threat, the fifth column of radical Islam, which is the greatest challenge we face, particularly because they do seek to overthrow our institutions and our culture and our way of life. And unfortunately, nobody in the mainstream media is talking about this, and we are essentially frogs in boiling water.
I mean, is there a chance that you are overstating or unintentionally exaggerating these with worst case figures and numbers?
Well, they're not worst case. These are just the figures that people have admitted to. I think there's a gross underestimate on actually the scale of the problem that we face in this country, and there's a whole bunch of other issues too. If you just look at the number of I like to quote the statistic: 1/3 of young Muslims aged 16 to 24 believe you should be put to death for apostasy. 52% believe that homosexuality should be illegal when it's only 5% in the broader population. 62% want to suppress free speech to avoid causing offense to religion and so forth. And when you combine that with the radical left, who also believe that suppression of free speech is important to protect freedom from offense, we're going to be entering into a world in 20 or 30 years potentially when all of our values and beliefs disappear and mean nothing, and our hard-won freedoms will have been forgotten.
20 or 30 years?
Well, that's the potential risk. That's why I say we need to ensure that we take recognition of this fact and do whatever we can to mitigate the rise of two great forces, the rise of the radical left and the rise of radical Islam. It's the old red-green alliance, which I think, of course, is a very potent force. Both the left and the right, I call them the right because they are fascist, the radical Islam, they are both utopian ideologies. They're both authoritarian, and they both believe in creating a utopia. One is a socialist utopia, one is a caliphate. And in order to create that utopia, you need to have a reign of terror to bring it into play. And I think when they join forces, it's always bad news.
Well, in fact, there are, certainly features in common. Like Hassan al-Banna, the founder of the Muslim Brotherhood, started it much in the way you've described by creating institutions, universities, medical, school, and mosques, but not always religious ones, in order to spread the reach of the movement before then mobilizing it into something religious and political for the purposes of really domination and submission of others. So it is interesting that they found these partnerships between the far left and Islam, which in many respects, as you say, extreme Islam is fascist, and on the right, in other respects, it behaves as Marxism and the far left will do.
The irony is that that radical Islam are employing Soviet tactics to control and manipulate the left, right? What the Soviets called it Polezny Drauki, the useful idiots thing. This idea that it's only because of Palestine that Islam has an issue with the Jews, that there's no other reason for it. And of course, all those people who are marching in the streets for Palestine and so forth, they view Israel as a colonial oppressor. Right? And of course, the left hate imperialism, where of course everyone knows that Islam is the great imperialistic religion, it's a conquering religion. It regards Europe as being part of it.
And unashamedly, it's not a secret.
No.
It's a central part and a proud part, and a regularly stated part of quite mainstream Islam.
Yeah, mainstream Islam divides the world into two. You have you have the land of Islam and the land of war. The land of war will only become peaceful when it becomes the land of Islam.
And parts that were the land of Islam and are no longer are particularly ripe.
Well, that's the Israeli complex, isn't it? They cannot give up any territory or power that they influence.
And of course, now the Muslim Brotherhood's been outlawed in parts of the Middle East, but here in the UK, not. And it's really kind of taken root here as well. Tell me about that risk and how that's happened over time.
Yeah, the Muslim Brotherhood, a deeply insidious body, which is fundamentally anti-Semitic, fascist, and actually Nazi. It's a legitimate Muslim Nazi organization, hugely influenced by Nazism. When it was established, one of the first thing they did was to translate the Protocols of the Elder of Zion into Arabic. They translated Mein Kampf into Arabic, and that was a bestseller.
Still
And the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem, of course, people famously know, met with Hitler, but he helped set up a Nazi Waffen SS brigade in the Balkans to persecute Jews there. And the Muslim Brotherhood has been hugely successful in infiltrating the West. And today they're actually funded a lot by the Qataris as well. And the Qataris have funded more. There are only 350,000 people in Qatar, and they are the single biggest donor to American and British universities. Over $100 billion they've given to American universities, which is one of the reasons why you don't see any criticism of Islam, or indeed Israel is always the enemy when it comes to academia in those two countries, and much else beside. And if you look at what's happened in this country, Islamophobia was a term developed by the Muslim Brotherhood. Islamophobia is a nonsense term that shouldn't exist. Anti-Muslim hatred should be despised upon. It's just as vile as anti-Jew hatred. But the idea that of the Muslim Brotherhood was to try to obscure the difference between anti-Muslim hatred and criticism of Islam. And by coining this term Islamophobia, the desire was to actually suppress any dissent or anybody from criticizing the religion. And it was stupidly taken up by people like Trevor Phillips and the Runnymede Trust in this country. And now, of course, it's become embedded in our culture linguistically. And I think we should get rid of it altogether. We very worryingly have this platform of the Labour Party now to introduce a blasphemy law into this country, of this Islamophobia blasphemy law. No religion, no ideology should be free from criticism. That's very different from hating individual Muslims or a group of Muslims. We're talking about any ideology, and Islam is an ideology, should be open to criticism. We're told that it's racist to be Islamophobic. I'm sorry. I asked them, why is that? Oh, because most Muslims are non-white. I said, oh, really? I said, most Catholics are non-white. If I attack Catholicism, am I being racist? Most communists are Chinese. If I attack communism, it's absolutely absurd. We must resist this. In the 21st century, we cannot have a blasphemy law. And that potentially would mean that we're at the point, if this does come into pass, where any perceived attack on Muslimness or perceived Muslimness will fall into the category of Islamophobia. That could potentially mean that's criticizing the rape gangs, criticizing polygamy, criticizing child marriage or cousin marriage could potentially fall under Islamophobia. I mean, it's deeply sinister and worrying stuff. And ultimately, at its root is the Nazi Muslim Brotherhood.
So 20 or 30 years is the risk, you said. What's your escape plan?
Well, I firmly believe that you have to defend what you believe in, so I have no escape plan. This is my country. I was born here, and I will be British till I die, so I'm going to fight the good fight. I don't know whether I'll be around personally in 30 years to see it all, but no, and I think it behooves everybody who believes in Britain. Britain is the most remarkable country. No country has a greater impact on the modern world. No country shaped the world more than Great Britain did. We have a proud legacy and a proud heritage, and that's something worth fighting for.
Rafe, thank you so much for taking the time to talk us through all this. And if people want to follow you and see more, where should they look?
Well, they can Google my name in YouTube, or my ex-Twitter handle is RAFHM.
Thank you so much.
Pleasure, thank you.